been a day of chaos in Cairo. Hours after security forces opened fire on pro-Morsi protesters, the situation remains volatile. This morning, troops moved in to disperse thousands of Morsi supporters who've been staging a sit-in in Cairo for the last 6 weeks. Security forces fired tear gas at thousands of Morsi supporters who had set fire to part of a church, and thousands more protesters continued to clash with police in front of the government headquarters. Thousands of people have been injured, and it's feared the death toll will climb. According to reports, most of the bodies coming into a city morgue had gunshot wounds to the head. The unrest has spread beyond the capital, and UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has joined the chorus of condemnation. The European Union is calling for maximum restraint by all sides. Morsi became Egypt's first freely elected leader in June 2012, but failed to tackle deep economic issues and worried many Egyptians with apparent efforts to tighten Islamist rule. More than 300 people have already died in political violence since Morsi's overthrow last month.
Now, taking the story further, with us in studio is independent analyst Aisha Kaji. A very good evening to you, and thank you for joining us. Lots of developments coming out of Egypt, the latest being the resignation of Mohamed al-Baradei. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this military clampdown, if you will, the state of emergency, the firing of tear gas, and indeed live ammunition as well, according to my sources in Cairo, over the last 2 days, has been a long time in the making, a month in the making, as it were. The resignation of Mr. al-Baradei, I think, further delegitimizes the current regime in Egypt, the military-backed regime that has taken power after Mr. Morsi was ousted. And I think that, there's bound to be concern in capitals around the world. What is really of concern, though, is that, again, colleagues in Egypt say that much of the news coming out on the wires, for example, etc., is coming directly from state sources rather than from sources on the ground, and therefore the numbers are being downplayed, etc. And perhaps the situation is worse than is being portrayed currently in international media.
Would you say this is fueling tension, that democracy doesn't work?
No, I don't think it's about democracy not working. I think it is about democracy not being respected. Certainly, my view is, and I've said this several times on record, that the AU took the right decision in suspending Egypt in much the same way as it suspended Mali in the past, Madagascar, Central African Republic, etc. But the response from capitals in the Western world has been lukewarm, to say the least. And that's largely because of perhaps unresolved tensions regarding Islamist regimes, even democratically elected ones. And this is something that, Washington DC, London, Brussels, etc., are going to need to resolve quite quickly, because political Islam is on the rise through the Middle East, through the northern parts of Africa, and even sub-Saharan Africa. And if they don't find a way to deal with it, we're going to see perhaps a domino effect in the region, which is quite worrying.
Now, you've spoken about the AU. What about the United Nations and their stance?
Well, again, the United Nations, has come out and said there's a need for negotiation between all parties. Today, they've condemned the violence, etc. But other than that, they haven't been very proactive on the ground. They've talked about Egyptian-led solutions, etc. But they haven't really, I think, made sufficient attempt to broker an Egyptian-led solution, but to be the mediator in such a solution. Of course, if worst comes to worst, we're hearing reports already that war crimes have been committed. And if that is true and is found to be true, then perhaps the United Nations will step in the form of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because currently Egypt is not, a signatory to the African Court of Human and People's Rights, so it can't be brought there. But it could conceivably be brought before the ICC, even though it hasn't ratified the Rome Statute, because the Rome Statute makes provision for even non-member states to be brought before the court in the case that international crimes or crimes against humanity have been committed.
Now, you've said this is a long time coming, and analysts have been saying this has been on the cards since possibly the end of June. They said protesters were not initially being taken seriously enough. Would you say then that this was their last resort, their only option?
The protesters or the government?
Well, the protesters.
Absolutely. And that's been the one encouraging sign on both sides of this divide. Both amongst the pro-Morsi protesters as well as the protesters who took to the streets to oust him in the first place. It's been encouraging that Egyptians have taken this form or this notion of mass-based democracy to heart. However, the fact that it's turned violent, the fact that the military took over was bound, I think, to lead to concerns. Certainly it led to concerns immediately and was bound to lead to the kind of clampdown we're seeing currently, particularly because much of the military is still in the hands of pre-democracy elements who wield an enormous amount of both political and economic power in Egypt. And that is very, very telling. Yesterday, for example, several former generals and generals were made leaders of the provinces in Egypt. This is a harking back to the Mubarak era, really. And it is very, very dismaying to see that kind of retrogression, as it were.
How do you see this playing out?
With more violence, unfortunately, unless strong mediation is brought in immediately in the form of one or more of the intergovernmental organizations such as the AU or the UN. They really need to be proactive now if they want to stop more violence. Whether that will happen is questionable. And if that happens, it needs to be as inclusive as possible to ensure that we don't see further protests in the streets. We don't see people seeing that as their only way of making their voices heard. And given that much of the once democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood leadership is currently in detention, that Mr. Morsi's whereabouts are not really known, etc., whether this is now possible is questionable. There was a window of opportunity early in July. It wasn't seized then. And it's unfortunately led to unnecessary and widespread death.
Thank you very much for your time. That was independent analyst Aisha Kaji. Peter standing by with the latest from Somalia. I hear